1 week after moving into the new house, the previous owner called me. I forgot to disconnect the camera in the living room. I accidentally saw a secret. Don't tell anyone, come alone. When I arrived, the screen opened and played a video that shocked me breathless. I discovered a cruel truth about the very people I loved the most. I decided that within the next 72 hours, I would design the most perfect trap to take back everything that belonged to me. Hello everyone, welcome to our story. Please like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Important note: this is a fictional story with dramatized elements for storytelling purposes. Any similarities to real events are coincidental, but the lessons about trust, betrayal, and self-protection carry deep meaning. Now let's continue with what happened next. The rhythmic metallic screech of a rusted hinge was the only thing filling the silence of my workshop, until the vibration in my pocket shattered the peace. Vincent Carter, a 61-year-old retired civil engineer, was replacing a rusted hinge on my workshop door when the call that changed everything arrived. The sharp September sunlight slanted through the workshop window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air as I wiped a bead of sweat from my brow. The air was thick with the comforting scent of WD-40 and old cedar, a smell that usually grounded me in the quiet order I have maintained since my wife Patricia died 3 years ago. I had been focused on the tactile resistance of the metal, just one more turn on the screw to align the frame perfectly. Patricia always hated that sound of a squeaky door, so I suppose I was doing it for her as much as for myself. I reached into my denim pocket, feeling the cold vibration of my smartphone. It was an unknown number, but in a town like Beaverton, you usually answer, assuming it is a neighbor or the hardware store confirming an order. I pressed the screen and brought the phone to my ear, still tasting the bitter dregs of stale coffee on the back of my tongue. "Vincent, is that you?" a voice asked. It was raspy and rushed a stark contrast to the sleepy Tuesday afternoon vibe of the neighborhood. I recognized the caller after a second of processing the tone. Warren Phillips, my 72-year-old neighbor and a retired postal worker, possessed a voice that usually carried the slow weight of a man with nowhere to be. But today it was trembling. He told me he was calling from 3 houses down. Have you ever felt the air grow thin in a room you have lived in for 20 years? Suddenly the walls of my workshop felt like they were leaning in toward me as Warren continued speaking. He was breathless, explaining that he had made a mistake with the security system he helped me install back in the spring. "I forgot to disconnect the cloud account from my personal tablet, Vincent," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw something on the living room feed while you were out." My heart skipped a beat as the realization set in that my neighbor had been unintentionally spying on my private home life for months. I opened my mouth to protest, to ask why he was watching, but the urgency in his voice stopped me cold. "It involves your daughter Vincent and that husband of hers, Trevor." I felt a sharp pang of apprehension tighten in my chest. Olivia and Trevor had been over for dinner just 2 nights ago, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Warren refused to explain further over the phone, citing the sensitivity of what he had witnessed on the screen. He insisted that I come to his house immediately, and that I come alone. Then he said it. The name. Olivia. He warned me in no uncertain terms not to call her or send a text until I had seen the footage for myself. My daughter has always been the pillar of my life, especially after Patricia passed, and the idea that Warren was implying she was involved in something dark enough to require a secret meeting felt like a physical blow to my stomach. My hand tightened around the phone until my knuckles turned white. "What did you see, Warren?" I asked, but the line had already gone dead, leaving me standing in the silence of my workshop, with nothing but the smell of cedar and a growing sense of dread. The engine of my truck roared to life, a jagged sound that mirrored the sudden frantic drumming in my chest. I didn't waste time putting away my tools or locking the workshop. The urgency in Warren's voice had been a cold splash of reality that made the order of my woodshop feel irrelevant. I backed out of my driveway with a reckless speed I hadn't used in years, the tires chirping against the asphalt as I swung the wheel toward the quieter corner of Beaverton. My mind was a chaotic loop of questions. Why had my neighbor waited until now to tell me he was still connected to my security feed? More importantly, What could Olivia and Trevor possibly be doing in my house that would make a 72-year-old man sound like he'd seen a ghost? I drove the 3 streets over to Warren's modest ranch-style house, noting the faded blue siding and the overgrown hedges that suggested a man who had stopped caring about his own curb appeal. I pulled into his gravel driveway, the crunching sound under my tires, feeling like bone breaking in the heavy afternoon silence. I was out of the cab before the engine had even fully shuddered to a stop. Warren Phillips didn't even wait for me to knock. He opened the door as I reached the porch, his face a map of deep-set regret and sleepless lines. He looked older than he had just last week, his shoulders slumped as if under an invisible weight. I realized then that Warren wasn't just a nosy neighbor. There was a haunted look in his eyes that only comes from personal experience. He led me into a small, dimly lit den that smelled of stale tobacco and old yellowed paper. Trust is like a pane of glass. Once it's shattered, you can spend a lifetime trying to glue the shards back together, but you'll never stop seeing the cracks. Warren gestured for me to sit, but I stayed on my feet, my muscles coiled with a restless energy. He told me then in a voice that barely rose above a whisper why he was so vigilant. 15 years ago, his own son had systematically drained his life savings. It started with a simple lie about a mortgage payment and ended with Warren losing nearly everything but this faded ranch. I didn't think he was capable of it either, Vincent. He said, his hand trembling as he reached for a glass of water. By the time I checked the accounts, the ink was already dry and the money was gone. If you're wondering why I didn't just turn around and leave, it's because the truth, no matter how ugly, is always better than a comfortable lie. Warren pointed to a laptop sitting on a cluttered desk, its screen glowing with a harsh blue clinical light that seemed to leach the color from the room. He reminded me of the weekend in the spring when he'd helped me install the cameras for my Seattle trip, admitting he'd neglected to remove his credentials from the cloud app. He told me he hadn't watched all of the footage because it felt like a violation of my privacy, but the few minutes he did happen to see were enough to make him pick up the phone. He revealed that this wasn't just one isolated conversation. There were 5 separate recorded meetings that had occurred while I was at the firm. The silence in the den was heavy enough to feel like physical pressure against my lungs. Warren's finger hovered over the mouse for a split second. Then he clicked. The screen flickered, and suddenly I was looking into my own living room. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read, Monday, 2:15 p.m. The grainy pixels on the screen coalesced into the familiar comfort of my own living room. But the people sitting on my sofa looked like total strangers. My daughter, 34-year-old Olivia Morrison, sat on the edge of the sofa on the screen, her nervous fingers twisting the blue cardigan I'd given her for Christmas. Beside her, Trevor Morrison, my 37-year-old son-in-law, a logistics coordinator who always claimed to have a head for numbers, leaned back with a smirk that looked entirely too comfortable in my house. They weren't just visiting. They were going through a blue folder I recognized instantly from my desk. I watched as Trevor pulled out a document, laughing as he mimicked my signature in the air with a ballpoint pen. He didn't even blink when he signed the original. Trevor said, his voice tinny through the laptop speakers. It's not stealing if it's eventually going to be ours anyway, right? The betrayal wasn't a sudden impulse. It was a performance. Trevor began meticulously explaining to Olivia how he had tricked me into signing a packet of health directives that actually served as a shell for a total asset grab. He had inserted 2 extra pages, grant them full authority over my 401k and the deed to the house. I felt the air leave my lungs. I had trusted them with my medical future, and they had rewarded that trust by treating my life like a carcass to be picked clean before I was even cold. Olivia hesitated for a second, her eyes darting toward the hallway, as if she expected me to walk in. Trevor silenced her doubt by mentioning their mounting problems and reminding her that I barely check my accounts anyway. Your father trusts you, Olivia, he said, his voice dropping into a low, predatory register. That's his real weakness. Once the transfer is done, it's clean. House 401k everything. Have you ever seen someone you love look at your life like it was nothing more than a bank vault? They'd finally found the combination, for the cold horror of it made the air in Warren's den feel freezing. I was looking at a daughter I no longer recognized, and a man who saw my 30 years of civil engineering as a lottery ticket. He was finally cashing in. Warren stopped the video, his eyes full of a pity that made me want to scream. He explained there were 5 more files and initiated a transfer to my phone. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Each notification in my pocket felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. I stood up, my movements, mechanical and rigid, my body performing the actions of a living man, while my spirit felt like it had been hollowed out. "I'll send the rest to your phone," Warren said, his voice trembling. "You need to see all of it." I managed a small, stiff nod as I walked toward the door. "Thank you, Warren," I replied. "I've seen enough for now." I walked out into the cool September night, the silence of the neighborhood now feeling like a trap designed to keep me quiet while they dismantled my existence. As I reached my truck, I realized that the trust Trevor mocked wasn't just a character trait. It was the specific tool they had used to engineer my ruin. I looked up at the moon, its pale light reflecting off the screen of my phone, as the first download completed. File_02_Wednesday_planning.mp4. The fluorescent lights of the Canyon Road diner flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting long, sickly shadows over the booth where I sat with a cold laptop and a hot cup of coffee I didn't plan on drinking. I didn't go home. I couldn't bear to look at those 4 walls yet, knowing that every corner of my sanctuary had been violated by the very people I called family. I had pulled into this 24-hour haunt off the main drag, needing the anonymity of a corner booth and the low hum of the industrial refrigerator to anchor me. "Just coffee black. Leave the pot," I had told the waitress without looking up. I needed a moment of silence, or at least the closest thing to it that a roadside diner could offer at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The smell of burnt grease and industrial cleaner was a welcome distraction from the metallic scent of dread that had been clinging to me since I left Warren's house. My fingers felt like lead as I reached for the cold, smooth surface of the laptop keys. I opened the folder and prepared to watch the file labeled Wednesday Planning. The betrayal wasn't just about the money I'd spent 40 years earning. It was a calculated redirection of my entire digital identity. As the video played, showing Olivia and Trevor at my dining table, I watched as Trevor tapped on a legal pad with clinical precision. He was explaining to my daughter how they had already compromised my legal standing. "He won't track the changes if the notifications come through me," Trevor said on the screen, his smirk audible even through my headphones. He told Olivia that he had set up an email address she controlled to intercept any digital alerts from the county clerk. Have you ever sat in a public place and realized that every person around you is living a life of quiet normalcy while your own world is burning down in front of you? I looked at a truck driver, 2 booths down, methodically cutting into a steak, while on my screen Trevor mocked me for being too busy in my workshop to notice a change in my own deed. Olivia looked nervous, her eyes darting toward the hallway. But Trevor's confidence was infectious, a parasite that was slowly overwhelming her guilt. 20 days. That was the length of my remaining life as a homeowner. The video reached a chilling climax when Trevor pulled a physical calendar toward him and circled a date in bold red ink, September 30th. He looked directly at Olivia, his face hard. "We need to file the deed transfer by the morning of the 30th, he insisted. "If we don't have it recorded by then, the deal falls through." I watched him slide a paper napkin across the table, a gesture I found myself mimicking in the diner with a shaking hand. Trevor promised her it would be in her name before I even noticed a change in the property tax assessment. The theft wasn't an open-ended process. They were working against a hard deadline, implying an external pressure that made my skin crawl. I realized then that my house, the fortress Patricia and I had built together, was exactly 20 days away from being legally erased from under my feet. I pressed play on the 3rd file, my hand trembling, as Trevor's voice filled my headphones with a much darker tone. "They gave us until the 30th, Olivia. If we don't have the cash, they won't just take the house." The audio in the 3rd file was distorted by the wind blowing through the cracked patio door of my own home. I sat in the Canyon Road diner, watching the screen through a hazy reflection of the neon open sign that flickered with a rhythmic buzz. The audio crackled with the sound of a sliding glass door being forced open on the recording, but it was the low, predatory rumble of Trevor's voice that made the hair on my neck stand up. I watched the screen as he paced my living room, his smartphone pressed tightly to his ear. He was arguing with someone about a $180,000 balance, his voice dropping to a desperate, jagged whisper. It wasn't a bank or a legitimate lender on the other end. The slang and the threats Trevor was using made it clear he was dealing with an underground gambling ring. The debt wasn't a business failure or an honest mistake. Trevor had been siphoning my information to fuel a high-stakes addiction that had finally caught up to him. He promised the mysterious caller a full liquidation of assets by the 30th of September, confirming with a sickening finality that my home was simply the payment for his latest losing hand. Olivia entered the frame a few minutes later, her face red and blotchy from crying. Looking smaller than I had ever seen her, Trevor turned his aggression on her instantly, his body language turning sharp and invasive. He explained that the people he owed weren't patient men, and then he dropped a bombshell that made the blood drain from my face in that diner booth. If the transfer doesn't clear by the morning of the 30th, he warned her the collectors have threatened to visit the school. I closed my eyes for a second, and all I could see was Emma's smile as we planted the roses last spring. It was the only clean thing left in this mess, and the thought of her being used as leverage made my stomach turn. I felt a cold sweat slicking my palms as I gripped the edge of the table, the muffled sound of a waitress dropping a spoon in the distance, sounding like a gunshot in the heavy silence of my mind. He was using his own child as a human shield for a $180,000 debt. I paused the video, my hands shaking so violently I nearly knocked over my cold coffee. I could taste bitterness like copper in the back of my throat. Trevor wasn't just a thief or a liar. He was a monster who had put his own daughter's life on the line to save his own skin. My engineering mindset, the part of me that had spent decades calculating stress loads and structural integrity, finally kicked in. This wasn't just a financial leak anymore. It was a total structural failure of the family unit that required a complete and total demolition. They weren't just taking the house. They were taking Emma's safety, and that was a debt I would never allow them to pay with my bloodline. I was about to shut the laptop, my mind already racing toward a counteroffensive, when the fourth file finished its slow download. The thumbnail showed Trevor alone in my kitchen, after midnight, his face lit by the glow of a single burner, speaking to a woman whose voice I didn't recognize from our family circles. The fourth video was shorter, just a few minutes of Trevor alone in the kitchen after midnight. The kitchen where I'd made pancakes for my granddaughter just days ago now looked like a crime scene in the harsh blue light of my laptop screen. Trevor was leaning against the counter phone pressed to his ear, his voice hushed and intimate in a way he never spoke to my daughter. The woman on the other end had a light, airy voice I didn't recognize, and as they spoke, the rot at the center of my family was finally laid bare. He wasn't just stealing to pay a debt. Trevor was building a lifeboat. He revealed that Olivia was merely a tool to unlock my wealth, a signature machine he was manipulating with practiced ease. Once the assets are liquidated and the cash is in the offshore account, he whispered into the receiver, "I'm handling the exit. Olivia's blind loyalty makes it easy." I watched him chuckle, a dry, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "Pack your bags for Costa Rica," he told the stranger. "We're almost there." Disgust rose in my throat like bile, a visceral reaction to the man who had sat at my Thanksgiving table while planning to leave my daughter in the ruins of a forgery case. How many layers of rot can one family hide before the whole house comes crashing down? I stared at the screen, my heart turning into a block of cold flint. I clicked on the fifth and final file dated last Saturday. This one was a confrontation. Olivia was visibly terrified, her hands shaking, as she tried to tell Trevor she wanted to back out of the deed transfer. She felt watched, she said. She felt the weight of the lie, but Trevor didn't offer comfort. He turned brutal. He stepped into her personal space, grabbing her upper arm with a grip that looked painful even through the grainy footage. Then he did the unthinkable. He began reciting Emma's exact school recess schedule at Hawthorne Elementary. 10:15 a.m., he hissed. You want the investors waiting by the fence at 10:15. He wasn't just warning her about the criminals. Trevor was the one who had provided the schedule to the debt collectors. He had sold out his own daughter's safety to ensure Olivia wouldn't lose her nerve. I watched my daughter's spirit visibly break on the screen as she slumped into a chair, her resistance replaced by a hollow, defeated compliance. Hawthorne Elementary, 10:15 a.m. He knew exactly where she'd be standing. The diner was nearly empty now. The only sound, the low hum of the industrial refrigerator and the occasional tap of rain starting to hit the window pane. I closed the laptop, the silence of the booth feeling heavier than the noise of the city outside. I pulled out my yellow legal pad, the coarse paper feeling real and solid under my fingertips. I drew a single vertical line down the center, labeling the columns with the only two words that mattered now: protect and punish. I am a civil engineer. I have spent my life understanding how things hold together, and more importantly, exactly how they fail. I know how to find the structural weakness in a man, and Trevor Morrison was nothing but a series of fractures held together by ego. I realized that to save Emma, I had to be as methodical and ruthless as the man trying to destroy us. Protect the innocent first, I whispered to the empty diner. Deal with the guilty later. I walked out to the parking lot, the cool air sharp in my lungs. I started the engine and watched the dashboard clock flip to 1:32 a.m. By sunrise, the first pillar of Trevor's plan would be ready to fall. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of gray Oregon mist that hides everything in plain sight. I poured my oatmeal into the same ceramic bowl Patricia had bought on our 20th anniversary. My hand so steady it felt like I was back at the firm, drafting blueprints for a bridge that was never meant to collapse. I follow my 6:15 a.m. routine with surgical precision, showering, making coffee, and stepping onto the porch to feed the neighbor's cat. Every movement is a calculated mask to hide the fact that I spent the night cataloging my daughter's betrayal in a diner booth. The smell of cedar and morning rain drifts through the open window, a sharp, stinging clarity of light that makes the west slope look normal but feel entirely hollow. Routine is a shield I have worn for years, but today it feels like armor. Patricia would have known something was wrong the moment I walked into the kitchen. She always saw through my stoic engineering facade, but she isn't here to warn me about the rot growing in our own bloodline. The morning call from Olivia wasn't just routine. As the phone chirped on the counter, I realized she was using the exact distraction tactics I'd heard her and Trevor discuss in the video. She wasn't just a passive bystander. She was an active, conscious participant in the timing of this theft. At exactly 10 a.m., the digital chirp of my smartphone broke the silence. I picked it up, watching the name Olivia flash on the screen. "Hi, Dad, just checking in." Her voice came through light and carefully pitched to sound like a concerned daughter. "How are you feeling today?" I responded with the exact amount of warmth she expected, my voice steady, even as my mind replayed the footage of her twisting her cardigan while Trevor mapped out my ruin. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I told her. "Just working in the garden." "How is Emma?" Every word felt like a structural test. I realized that every inquiry into my health was actually a probe to see if her financial trap had been tripped yet. How do you band-aid a heart that's being shredded by the person you die to protect? I stood there clutching the cool, smooth ceramic of my bowl, listening to the rhythmic tap of the coffee maker, as my daughter lied to me with the same ease she used to tell me she'd finished her homework 25 years ago. Her voice was like a well-polished mirror, bright and clear, but only reflecting what I was supposed to see, hiding the dark silver backing where the lies were etched. "Olivia mentioned they would stop by tomorrow afternoon. Trevor wants to help you with that fence," she added. I agreed readily, maintaining the docile senior persona they've assigned to me. "I'd like that," I said. "I'll make sure to have some tea ready." But I knew better. Trevor's offer to fix the fence was a ruse to get me out of the house, a way to ensure I was occupied in the yard, while they searched my office for my original non-forged identity documents. They needed the real papers to make the fake ones stick. As soon as the line went dead, The warmth left my face like a sunset behind a storm wall. The facade was for them, but the action was for me. I grabbed my keys, the metal cold against my palm. I pulled out of the driveway, but I wasn't heading to the hardware store for fence supplies. I was heading to a place where I could find a very different kind of specialist. The sliding glass doors of the Beaverton Library hissed shut behind me, sealing out the damp Oregon morning and leaving me in a silence that felt heavy with the secrets I was about to dig up. I walked past the front desk with a stiff nod, seeking out a back corner computer terminal where the stacks would shield me from any inquisitive eyes. My own laptop was back in the workshop, but I needed a neutral digital trail today. I sat down and began searching for specialists in power of attorney fraud and elder abuse, my engineer's mind, filtering through names and reviews like I was auditing a structural schematic. One name consistently surfaced with high praise: Evelyn Chambers. Her profile described a woman who didn't just know the law, but knew how to weaponize it against those who prey on the vulnerable. My hands stilled on the keyboard when I realized Chambers was the same lead counsel who handled the high-profile case Warren Phillips had mentioned last week. She had a personal history with exactly the kind of toxic greed Trevor was exhibiting. I didn't need someone to just defend my assets. I needed someone who knew how to dismantle a predator. I stepped into the library lobby and dialed the number for Chambers' office. The receptionist was professional, but I could hear the sharp, jagged edge of urgency in my own voice as I mentioned words like power of attorney revocation and fraudulent filings. I felt a small surge of momentum when she scheduled me for a consultation on Friday morning at 9:30 a.m. I spent the rest of the afternoon at a nearby print shop, the air thick with the smell of toner and warm paper, as I meticulously scanned the files Warren had given me. I organized them into a heavy physical folder, creating a legal arsenal that felt as solid as a foundation stone in my hands. Have you ever looked at your own front door and realized it was no longer an entrance, but a barricade you were about to breach? I drove home with that heavy folder tucked deep under my passenger seat, the taste of copper in the back of my throat as the adrenaline began to spike. There they were, the predators on the porch. As I turned onto my street, my heart hammered against my ribs at the sight of Olivia's silver sedan parked in my driveway, with Trevor's black truck idling behind it. They weren't supposed to be here until tomorrow afternoon. My 5-year-old granddaughter Emma was a bright spark of blonde hair and boundless energy sitting on the porch swing with a coloring book that she abandoned the moment she saw my truck. I forced a smile for her, a mask that felt like it might crack my face open. Trevor stepped off the porch, flanked by a man in a gray jumpsuit, carrying a heavy tool bag, a handyman. Trevor called him, but I recognized the distinctive set of picks hanging from his belt. He was a locksmith. Trevor wasn't here for a social visit. He had brought a specialist of his own to help him bypass the safe in my basement, where I kept the original property deed. I gripped the legal folder tightly, sliding it deep into the dark crevice between the seats as Trevor approached the driver's side window, his eyes searching my face for any sign that the old man had finally figured out the game. The walk from the driveway to the porch felt like a march toward a gallows I'd built for my own family. A grandfather's smile is supposed to be the easiest thing in the world to wear, but as I stepped onto the porch, mine felt like a mask made of lead, heavy and cold against my skin. I forced my features into a practiced softness, greeting Emma with a hug that felt like the only real thing left in this house. Stepping inside, I entered a space that no longer felt like mine. Olivia was in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, as she helped Emma with a coloring book, looking every bit the devoted daughter I had raised. Trevor stood in the hallway, his presence a jagged intrusion in the foyer. He didn't even wait for a hello before asking about the refinance folder he claimed I'd left out on the desk. I had to swallow the bitter bile rising in my throat and pretend I'd forgotten exactly where I put it. I played the part of the slightly confused senior they so desperately wanted me to be, watching Trevor's artificial, gleaming smile widen as he thought he was winning. During a brief moment over the counter, Olivia made a strange slip of the tongue, mentioning a Costa Rica travel brochure she'd seen. It was a chilling revelation. Trevor was already grooming her for the move, though she clearly didn't realize she wasn't actually part of his real exit plan. We eventually sat down to a dinner of takeout Thai food, the air thick with the smell of spicy ginger and soy that couldn't mask the unspoken lies. Trevor was overly friendly, a predator in a polo shirt, talking about future-proofing my estate, while Olivia kept her eyes fixed on her plate. Her guilt was nearly visible in the way her hands trembled as she held her fork. I watched Emma eat her innocence, the only thing keeping me from flipping the table and shouting the truth. Every laugh from Trevor felt like a physical blow to my chest, a reminder of the mistress and the gambling debt he was hiding behind this domestic farce. Have you ever looked at the face of your own child and seen a stranger looking back, counting the days until you're out of the way? I felt a nausea that no amount of tea could wash away. Trevor leaned in, insisting we finalize the deed update next week for my own protection. I nodded, playing the docile fool. "You're right, Trevor," I said. "Safety first." That's what I always say. Tick, tick, tick. The wall clock wasn't just measuring time. It was counting down to a collision. Long after they'd left, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house louder than the dinner conversation. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift, like the fraudulent clauses Trevor had inserted into my life. I realized I had 48 hours until I met Evelyn Chambers. That was 48 hours of looking my daughter in the eye and pretending I didn't know she was helping a man who intended to discard her like trash. The rough texture of the bedsheets felt like sandpaper as I twisted in the dark. I stood up to get water and noticed the workshop door slightly ajar. My heart stopped. I checked the logs later. Trevor hadn't just stopped by early. He'd gone into the workshop while I was busy at the table and took photos of my personal ledger looking for the account numbers to bypass my remaining security. I closed my eyes, but the last thing I saw wasn't sleep. It was the red light on the workshop security panel blinking like a warning I was finally ready to heed. The morning sun had been too bright, a cruel contrast to the dark reality of my living room. But by the afternoon, the typical Oregon gray had returned to settle over Beaverton. Emma's laughter was a bright silver thread cutting through the heavy mist, a sound so pure, it made the lies sitting in my pocket feel like lead weights. We were in the backyard garden, a sanctuary that felt more honest than the house ever could lately. I watched my 5-year-old granddaughter hop between the rows of tomato plants Patricia had planted before she got sick. The garden was a living memory of my late wife, and watching Emma nurture it made the threat against her safety feel even more visceral. I knelt in the dirt, the damp earth staining my jeans and creeping under my fingernails, trying to anchor myself in this moment of innocence. "Look, Grandpa. The tomatoes are getting bigger," she shouted, her voice full of a wonder I'd forgotten existed. "They are, Emma," I replied, wiping a cold mist from the garden hose off my cheek. "Just like you." As we moved between the vines, Emma leaned in close, her eyes wide as she shared a secret. "Daddy told me I was going on a long airplane trip soon," she whispered. My heart stopped. It was the confirmation I'd feared. Trevor was already packing her world into a suitcase, planning an escape that likely left Olivia behind. Innocence is a fragile thing, like the first frost on a greenhouse window. One warm breath of truth and it vanishes forever. I looked at the little girl who still saw the world as a place of building blocks and garden fairies. "Grandpa, when I grow up, will you teach me to build things?" she asked, her small hand reaching out to touch a ripening fruit. The question mirrored a promise I once made to a young Olivia, a cycle of trust that had been broken by the generation in between. "I'll teach you everything I know, sweetheart." I promised, my voice thick with a solemn conviction. I looked up to see Olivia watching us from the patio, her face unreadable. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my house. I was fighting for the version of Olivia that Emma still believed in. I wanted to reach out to warn my daughter that the man she loved was tracking her like a prisoner, but the facade had to hold. I stayed on my knees in the dirt, feeling the heavy burden of the grandfather Emma thought I was, and the predator I was becoming to protect her. An airplane trip. He was already planning to vanish with her. The spell of the garden was broken when Olivia called Emma to the car. "Come on, Emma, we need to get home." Her voice carried a sharp edge that made my skin crawl. I stood on the porch, my hands hanging heavy at my sides, and watched as they walked to the silver sedan. "Bye, Grandpa. See you tomorrow." Emma waved as she climbed into her seat. I managed a stiff wave back, watching the red taillights of the car fade into the gathering gray. As the car pulled away, a flash of metallic silver caught the low light. There, tucked under the curve of the rear bumper, sat a small magnetic GPS tracker. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Trevor wasn't just monitoring my accounts. He was monitoring his wife's movements to ensure no one interfered with his exit. I watched the empty street for a long time. The shadow of that tracker burned into my mind. I wasn't just up against a thief. I was up against a jailer. The kitchen was too quiet, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sounding less like a timepiece and more like a judge's gavel striking the bench over and over. I stood at the counter, the smell of grilled chicken and rice filling the air. Yet I had no appetite. I had spent 40 years designing structures meant to withstand the elements, but I was currently failing to withstand the silence of my own home. The dining table felt like a vast, empty continent, with Patricia's chair at the head and Olivia's childhood spot to my left, both vacant. And I sat in the dim light, realizing that in the years since I lost Patricia, I'd grown used to the quiet. But tonight, the silence had a jagged, heavy edge that made my skin crawl. "It's just dinner, Vincent," I whispered to the empty room. "Eat." But the food tasted like ash. This house used to be so loud with laughter and the chaotic energy of a growing family, and now it was just a shell filled with echoes. While I was cleaning the table afterward, my fingers brushed against something hard under the rim of my own chair. I leaned down, peeling back a strip of adhesive. A microphone, small, black, and cold. Trevor wasn't just tracking Olivia. He was listening to my private moments. How many years of trust does it take to build a life? And how many seconds of greed does it take to tear it down? I held the bug in my palm, the metallic intrusion making me feel physically ill. Trevor Morrison was a cancer, and my daughter was merely infected. I walked to the pantry door, my thumb tracing the rough texture of the growth chart notches carved into the wood. I wondered when Olivia stopped being the girl who cried over a scraped knee and became the woman who could help forge a signature. Did I fail her, or did I just stop paying attention while I was busy being the provider? The guilt was a heavy weight, but then I remembered the way Trevor had weaponized Emma's school schedule. The self-doubt evaporated, replaced by a cold, protective fire that burned away the last of my hesitation. A microphone in my own home. The intrusion was total, but so was my response. I didn't smash the device. I simply put it back. If Trevor wanted to listen, I would give him exactly what I wanted him to hear, nothing but the sounds of an old man going to bed early. I moved to the den with mechanical precision, closing the door softly. I began to finalize the documents for tomorrow's meeting with Evelyn Chambers. I organized the bank statements, the forged power of attorney copy Warren gave me, and my own original documents into a neat, high-tensile stack. I am no longer just a father or a grandfather. I am an engineer building a fortress that no gambler or thief can breach. Everything was in its place, just like a blueprint. As I prepared the folder, I realized Trevor's biggest tactical error, the original deed he was so desperate to find, was never in this house. Years ago, as part of my own engineer's redundancy plan, I had moved it to a secure safety deposit box. Tomorrow, the doors lock. I set the folder on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. But as the darkness swallowed the room, I knew that Trevor's biggest mistake wasn't the theft, it was underestimating a man who had nothing left to lose but the truth. Friday morning, September 20th, arrived with a sky the color of cold steel. I pulled the heavy brass handle of the law office door at exactly 9:15 a.m. The cold September air biting at my heels, as if trying to pull me back into the comfort of my own ignorance. I was met with the faint, dignified scent of old paper and expensive coffee that seemed to cling to the dark wood of the reception desk. Within minutes, I was ushered into the inner sanctum to meet Evelyn Chambers, a 56-year-old attorney specializing in elder law, who sat behind a desk as clean and sharp as her intellect, her eyes possessing the clinical depth of a master inspector. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I simply placed the organized folder on the mahogany surface between us. As an engineer, I presented the facts as a series of load-bearing failures in my family's foundation. I need a legal bulkhead, Ms. Chambers, I said. Something Trevor Morrison cannot bypass. She looked at me for a long moment before opening the file. Tell me everything, Mr. Carter. She replied with a voice that was both firm and inviting. Don't leave out the parts that hurt. Evelyn revealed something almost immediately. The notary who supposedly witnessed the forged power of attorney was a known associate of a local shady lender. This confirmed that Trevor had already entangled my life with a criminal network. Evelyn reviewed the documents with a clinical intensity, her finger stopping on specific clauses Trevor had inserted into the text. She explained that while the health directive was what I had intended to sign, the filed version granted broad financial authority that bordered on total guardianship. This clause here, she noted, tracing a line on the paper. It grants broad financial authority. Did you intend that? My jaw tightened? No, I intended to protect my health, not lose my home. Her calm voice provided a stabilizing contrast to the quiet rage I had been fueling all week. Have you ever felt the exact moment the tide turns? It doesn't happen with a roar. It happens in the silence between heartbeats. I felt the weight of the last few days begin to shift as Evelyn outlined our counteroffensive. She was a master of the legal structure, identifying every weak point Trevor had tried to exploit. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were preparing to demolish his carefully constructed lies. Click. The sound of a door locking from the inside. His power was gone. Evelyn's assistant brought in the fresh revocation papers, and I signed them with a hand that didn't tremble, the black ink feeling like a seal on a containment vessel. The notary's stamp hit the paper with a sharp metallic click that echoed in the quiet room, a sound of absolute finality. Evelyn promised that by noon, every major bank and the county recorder would have electronic notice that the Morrison power was dead. It's done, she said, leaning back. You've officially taken back the keys to your life. I looked at the drying ink, a grim satisfaction settling over me. Good, I replied. Now I want to see how he tries to open the locks. As I rose to leave, Evelyn informed me that she had already flagged my social security number for potential identity theft. She discovered that Trevor had attempted to open a new credit line in my name just 48 hours prior. I walked out of that office and headed straight for the bank, checking my watch as the digital numbers flipped to 11 a.m. The countdown to Trevor's collapse had officially begun. The bank lobby was a tomb of glass and marble, and I was there to bury Trevor's access to my life savings once and for all. I stepped into the clinical, sterile-smelling air of First National Bank with a jaw set like concrete. The bank lobby was busy, but for me everything else had faded into a blurred background of ticking clocks and shuffling papers. I was ushered into a glass-walled office to meet Andrea Bennett, a 42-year-old personal banker with a sharp bob and even sharper eyes, who had been the gatekeeper of my finances since Patricia was still alive. I didn't waste time. I presented the certified revocation papers from Evelyn's office, the heavy stock paper feeling like a weapon in my hand. Andrea, I need these funds moved to a private account immediately. I told her, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register. I watched her scan the documents, her professional mask slipping just for a second when she realized the scope of the fraud. Mr. Carter, given the power of attorney revocation. I've flagged this for the fraud department as well, she said. Then she leaned in, her voice hushed. I should tell you, Trevor Morrison called this morning to inquire about daily withdrawal limits. My stomach did a slow roll. My timing had been a matter of mere hours. If I had waited until the afternoon, the $680,000 I'd spent 40 years building would have been a ghost. Do you know the difference between a fence and a fortress? A fence keeps people out. A fortress makes them regret trying to get in. I sat in silence as Andrea's pen scratched across the forms, finalizing the transfer of my liquid assets into a newly established individual account. We didn't just move the money. We implemented a total scorched earth policy on my digital footprint. We changed every password recovery email and security question, implementing dual-factor authentication that required my physical signature in person for any transaction over $5,000. The cool, steady hum of the air conditioning seemed to keep pace with the focused rhythm of my breathing. Once the final digital vault was sealed, I walked out to my truck, the weight off my chest, feeling like a physical lightness in my step. I sat in the parking lot and made a call to a former colleague, a retired investigator with deep FBI connections. I provided specific details about the illegal gambling operation Trevor mentioned in the recordings, framing it as an immediate threat to Emma's safety. Monday morning, Vincent, my contact, promised, the voice sounding like gravel. The wheels will start turning. Cold satisfaction settled over me. Trevor wasn't just fighting a civil battle now. He was walking into a federal trap. Locked, barred, secured. The Morrison era was over. I returned home and sat at my kitchen table with my yellow legal pad, the rough surface familiar under my palm. I created a final spreadsheet with 3 columns: assets secured, authority revoked, and exposure logged. I checked off every box with a steady hand, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in my glasses as I audited my own defense. The house was quiet, but for the first time in weeks, the silence felt like a victory rather than a haunting. Every door was locked both physically and legally. As I went to close my laptop, a small notification caught my eye on the network admin panel. A new, unauthorized device was logged into my home's Wi-Fi. Trevor was using a signal booster from the rental house across the street to try and hack into my server. I watched the unknown device blink on my screen, a ghost in the machine that thought it was still in control. "Go ahead, Trevor," I whispered to the empty room. "Try the door." Monday morning arrived with a notification that made my phone vibrate against the nightstand, like a warning siren signaling that the first wall of my fortress had been struck. I didn't reach for it with the panic of a victim, but with the cold, measured movements of an engineer monitoring a stress test. The sharp, rhythmic vibration was the only sound in my bedroom, aside from the low hum of the rain against the glass. I sat up, the smell of cold coffee sitting on the nightstand, from my late-night vigil stinging my nostrils. The automated alert from my bank was precise, an attempted login using my credentials from an unrecognized IP address in Southeast Beaverton. I didn't need to guess who it was. I opened my laptop, the blue, sterile light washing over my face, and logged into the hidden ceiling camera feed I had established in Olivia's rental house. On the screen, I saw my daughter sitting at her small kitchen table. Her face was illuminated by the flickering glow of her own screen, her brow furrowed in deep frustration. She was trying and failing to use a backdoor password Trevor had generated weeks ago, using a keylogger he'd secretly installed on my workshop computer. I watched her fingers fly across the keys, desperate to find the crack in the foundation I had already reinforced with steel. "Come on, work," I heard her whisper through the high-gain microphone. "Why is it asking for a physical token?" Have you ever watched a predator realize they've stepped into a trap of their own making? The silence that follows is the loudest sound in the world. I watched her lean back, her eyes wide with a growing, frantic realization. She picked up her phone and dialed a number on speakerphone. I adjusted my volume, listening, as she identified herself to a bank representative. Her voice pitched high with a forced, artificial politeness. She attempted to use the power of attorney to verify what she called a technical glitch. But the representative's voice was a wall of clinical finality. "I am sorry, ma'am," the voice crackled through the distorted speakers, "but that authority was formally revoked as of noon last Friday. All accounts are currently under a restricted freeze pending a secondary fraud investigation." The blood drained from Olivia's face in high definition, a silent, hollow scream captured in the grain of the video. It was the look of a bridge collapsing in slow motion. Southeast Beaverton, 82nd Avenue. I was watching her world collapse from 30 miles away. Olivia's hands trembled so violently, she almost dropped the phone as she ended the call. She didn't wait a second before redialing Trevor. I watched her pace the small living room, her eyes darting toward the window with the wide, white-rimmed stare of a cornered animal. She was clutching a legal pad, her knuckles white. When Trevor didn't pick up, she left a frantic voicemail, her voice cracking under the pressure. Trevor, pick up. The bank. They said it is gone. Everything is blocked. He knows Trevor. I think he knows everything. But then she added something that made my blood run cold. She mentioned a third account, something about a subsidiary filing Trevor had made in my name that I hadn't found in my own audit. The fraud was deeper and more complex than even I had mapped out. I closed my laptop, the image of my daughter's total unraveling etched into my mind like a failed stress test. I watched the status bar on my screen. Trevor's car was just pulling into her driveway, and the look on his face through the dash cam hack was pure, unadulterated rage. The sound of Trevor's tires screeching on the asphalt was the first thing the audio recorder picked up, a jagged tearing of the quiet evening air. The front door of the rental didn't just open. It hit the wall with a crack that sounded like a gunshot through my laptop. Speakers followed immediately by the heavy, uneven tread of a man who had lost his grip on everything but his anger. I adjusted the grainy, high-contrast night vision feed on my screen, watching as Trevor Morrison stormed into the living room, bringing the smell of rain and exhaust with him. He threw his keys onto the counter with enough force to rattle the dishes in the sink. Olivia was cowering near the counter, her face pale and tear-streaked. Trevor began pacing the small space like a caged predator, his voice a low, vibrating growl as he demanded to know exactly what the bank teller said. He refused to believe the old man could have been smart enough to revoke the authority on his own. "What do you mean, revoked?" he roared. I saw him sign those papers. Olivia's voice was thin, a structural failure in itself. "He's a retired engineer, Trevor. He's not stupid. He's methodical." That was when Trevor pulled out a folded document. He revealed that he had already pre-signed a quitclaim deed using the forged power of attorney, intending to bypass the bank entirely by going straight for the land title. Have you ever seen the exact moment a person realizes they've sold their soul for a debt they can never pay? It looks like Olivia's face right now. I watched as Trevor's desperation turned into physical intimidation. He grabbed Olivia by the shoulders, his white-knuckled grip shaking her, as he explained that the people he owed were done waiting. The September 30th deadline was immovable. 7 days, Olivia. We have 7 days before they stop calling and start knocking. He forced her to look at him, reminding her that she was already an accomplice, and that the police wouldn't care who started the forgery once the signatures were verified. "You signed those papers too," he hissed. "You're in this as deep as I am. You want to lose Emma to the state." The cruelty of his logic was a pressure cooker, and I could see my daughter's spirit buckling under the load. 7 days. 7 days until the wolves came for my family, and Trevor was the one holding the door open. My heart felt like it was being compressed in a vice as I watched his hands on her, my own breathing heavy and synchronized with the static on the feed. Trevor eventually calmed down into a cold, sharp focus that was far more terrifying than his yelling. He decided that the bank was a lost cause for now, and pivoted the entire plan toward the property deed. "Forget the cash," he said, his eyes narrow. "If we get the deed recorded at the county office, we own the leverage." He instructed Olivia to have the paperwork ready for the morning, claiming the land title office wouldn't have the revocation update for another 48 hours. "Tomorrow morning. The county office. Be ready." I watched as he slammed out of the house, but the audio stayed live as he reached his truck. He made a muffled phone call to his mistress, revealing that he planned to cut the wait, meaning Olivia, as soon as the deed was filed. The bastard had no loyalty even as the ship was sinking. He left Olivia collapsed in a chair, sobbing into her hands. I watched her reach for her phone, her fingers hovering over my contact name for a long, agonizing minute before she slowly put the device face down on the table and let out a sob that broke my heart all over again. Tuesday morning arrived with a stillness that felt like the intake of breath before a scream, and through the pinhole lens of the ceiling camera, I watched my son-in-law become a monster. I sat in my workshop surrounded by the scent of cedar and oil, but my mind was miles away in Olivia's rental. Trevor was pacing the small living room, Like a caged predator, his movements jagged and aggressive. He was berating Olivia for her hesitation, insisting that they file the deed transfer at the county office today before I could block it. His desperation was palpable. He checked his watch every few seconds, signaling that his debt-induced clock was ticking toward zero. Olivia sat on the sofa, clutching a throw pillow to her chest, as if it were a tactical shield against the storm of his anger. "We go to the county office today." Trevor barked, his face leaning into hers. "I don't care if you're scared." Olivia's voice was a fragile whisper. "What if Dad knows Trevor? What if he is waiting for us?" Trevor let out a jagged sound that was supposed to be a laugh. "He's an old man, Olivia. He's probably just confused by the new bank app." Then Trevor dropped the mask entirely. He admitted that he had personally walked the loan sharks past Emma's school to show them the target, proving his betrayal was an active choice, not a desperate reaction. "Have you ever heard the sound of a mother's soul being traded for a lie? It's a silence so deep it swallows the room." Trevor snapped, grabbing Olivia's arm with a white-knuckled grip and pulling her toward him. He dropped the cold, final threat. The loan sharks knew Emma's exact recess time at Hawthorne Elementary, 10:15 a.m. He told her that if they didn't deliver the deed as collateral today, those criminals would make an example of our 5-year-old by the playground fence. I felt a sour, sharp scent of fear, my own or hers I couldn't tell, drift through the mental image of the screen. I watched my daughter collapse into total defeat, her spirit breaking, as she realized her own husband had weaponized their child's safety. "You said you would leave her out of this." She sobbed, her body shaking under the load of his coercion. "You promised." Trevor didn't flinch. "Promises don't pay debts, Olivia. Only deeds do." He let go of her arm, leaving red marks on her skin that burned into my retinas. 9:00 a.m. That was the time they set for the end of my life. I decided it would be the start of theirs. Olivia nodded slowly, her face a mask of hollow grief, as she agreed to meet him at the county office tomorrow morning to finalize the filing. Trevor smoothed his shirt with a chilling return to composure, as if he hadn't just threatened a child. "Good girl," he said, his voice returning to that artificial, oily warmth. "Just act like nothing is wrong when the old man calls." As he headed for the door, he instructed her to bring the notarized backup, revealing a second set of forged documents I hadn't accounted for in my initial audit. I felt a cold, mechanical click in my chest as I closed the laptop lid. The silence of my workshop now felt like a command center. They expect to meet a clerk tomorrow. They are going to meet the truth. I reached for my phone and dialed Evelyn Chambers, my voice a whisper that carried the weight of a funeral. "It's happening tomorrow, Evelyn. We need to be ready by 9. The phone call to Evelyn was brief, the kind of conversation men have when there are no words left to waste, and the only thing remaining is the cold, hard geometry of a trap. I stood in my workshop, the smell of cold iron and motor oil clinging to my flannel shirt, feeling the strategic weight of the next 24 hours. I relayed the updated timeline to Evelyn Chambers, informing her that Trevor and Olivia intended to file the forged deed at the county office tomorrow morning at 9. I explained that Trevor had doubled down, weaponizing Emma's safety to force Olivia's hand. Evelyn's voice remained a pillar of professional ice over the line. She informed me that simply blocking the deed at the county level wasn't enough to stop Trevor's criminal associates. To trigger an immediate state-level asset freeze and provide the protection we needed, we required a formal, in-person service of process. "We won't just block them, Vincent," she said. "We will serve them in the act." She agreed to coordinate with a civil process server to meet me at Olivia's rental house instead of the courthouse. We weren't just stopping a theft. We were turning their moment of victory into a formal ambush. I sat at my workbench and opened my tablet, the smooth screen glowing with the raw data of my family's betrayal. I didn't need the images of their faces anymore. The scratchy recorded voices were enough to dismantle Trevor's house of cards. I began the methodical process of cueing specific clips, my fingers moving with the precision I used to apply to bridge schematics. I selected the recording, where Trevor mocked Olivia's blind loyalty while planning to abandon her for Costa Rica. Then I cued the chilling moment where he detailed Emma's school recess schedule. This isn't just evidence, I whispered to the empty workshop. It's a mirror. I tested the volume levels, ensuring the audio was clear enough to pierce through any lie Trevor might try to tell. Have you ever held the power to destroy a man's life in the palm of your hand? It's lighter than you'd expect, about the weight of a 10-inch tablet. I felt a calculated fury warming my chest, a stark contrast to the damp Oregon evening pressing against the workshop windows. Click. The playback was perfect. The betrayal was audible. I received a final text from Evelyn, confirming that because I had recorded these conversations in my own home, Oregon's one-party consent laws made the evidence fully admissible in civil proceedings. My home, my rules. The truth doesn't need permission when the foundation is already under attack. I felt a strange sense of professional satisfaction. As an engineer, I appreciate a system that works exactly as it was intended. I watched the low digital hum of the charging tablet and placed it carefully inside my jacket pocket. The weight of the device felt like a holstered weapon, solid and ready. As I reviewed the audio one last time, a voice caught my ear that I hadn't fully processed before. The woman Trevor was speaking to, the mistress he intended to flee with, wasn't a stranger. Her laugh was distinctive, a sharp sound I recognized from a rival engineering firm I had consulted for years ago. This wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a layer of industrial espionage I hadn't seen coming. I plugged the charger into the wall and watched the little green lightning bolt appear on the screen. It was the only light in the workshop, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. The darkness in the workshop was absolute, save for the single wedding photo still hanging near the door, a relic of a 1990 promise that felt like it was screaming in the silence. I sat on my old wooden stool, the smell of cold sawdust and motor oil anchoring me to a life Patricia and I had built, brick by brick, over 30 years. I reached out my fingers, brushing the cool, smooth glass of the frame. As I adjusted the backing, a thin piece of paper fluttered out, a letter Patricia had tucked away before the cancer took her. I read her elegant script by the dim glow of my flashlight, my heart constricting as I saw her warnings about our daughter. She had seen Olivia's blind spots long before. I had specifically her tendency to lose herself in men who mirrored the chaos she didn't know how to fix. Am I saving her, Patricia? I whispered into the rafters. Or am I just finishing what Trevor started? The agonizing weight of the morning's mission pressed down on me. I was about to destroy my daughter's current reality, yet I knew it was the only way to safeguard our granddaughter's future. Protect the innocent first, I reminded myself. Deal with the guilty later. I recalled Emma's face in the garden, the way her eyes lit up when she asked me to teach her how to build. Then, like a physical blow, I replayed Trevor's voice on the recording, reciting her school schedule, like he was reading a menu for a predator. The conflict inside me crystallized into a cold, hard line in the sand. Trevor Morrison would receive no mercy, but Olivia had to be given a door to walk through, however narrow. If you had to set your own house on fire to kill the snakes inside, would you have the courage to strike the match? I knew the answer now. Emma loses a mother if I destroy Olivia entirely, but she loses her life if I do nothing. Love in this house had always meant providing, but now it meant enforcing consequences. Being a father didn't just mean shielding your children. Sometimes it meant letting them strike the ground hard enough to finally wake up. I felt a determined moral clarity wash over me, replacing the soul-searching agony that had kept me paralyzed since the first phone call from Warren. Silence. Then the click of the latch. The decision was made. I stood up and walked to the small wall calendar where I used to track bridge project deadlines and concrete pours. I didn't see engineering dates anymore. I saw the geometry of a life-saving operation. I decided on my own protocol, separate from the legal one Olivia would have until sunset tomorrow, to choose Emma over Trevor. I turn off the workshop light, leaving only the green charging glow of the tablet to pierce the gloom. I walked toward the house, my boots crunching on the gravel with a stride that had no room for further doubt. I was ready for the morning. Choice is a structural necessity, and I was about to force hers. By offering her a path to redemption, I knew I was violating the strict total asset freeze Evelyn recommended, potentially putting my own legal standing at risk. But some things are worth the hazard. I set the alarm for 7:30 a.m. and lay in the dark, my heart beating with the slow, heavy thud of a ticking clock that was about to strike 9. Wednesday morning arrived with the clinical chill of an operating room, and as I buttoned my gray shirt, I felt less like a father and more like a surgeon about to excise a tumor. I followed my routine with robotic precision brewing coffee, charring a single slice of toast, and feeding the neighbor's cat. These mundane acts steadied my hands, though I found myself checking my watch every 5 minutes, as if I were timing a detonation. At 8:30 a.m., I pulled out of my driveway, heading toward the Southeast 82nd Avenue rental. The commute felt like a funeral procession for the life I used to know. I parked a block away on a side street, blending my truck into the long shadows of a large oak tree to wait for the legal team. I realized that Officer Walsh wasn't just here to serve papers. He had been fully briefed on the Costa Rica threat and was prepared to initiate an emergency welfare check on Emma the moment that door opened. I sat in the cab, gripping the steering wheel, until my knuckles matched the color of the gray sky. Routine can steady the mind, I whispered to my reflection in the rearview mirror. Steady, Vincent. Just 10 more minutes. At 8:55 a.m., Evelyn Chambers' silver sedan pulled up behind me, followed immediately by Officer Walsh in his marked cruiser. The sight of the police lights, even unlit, made the reality of the situation settle in my gut like lead. We didn't speak as we stepped onto the pavement. We exchanged a single grim nod. I looked through the front window of the rental from my vantage point and saw Olivia pacing the living room in that blue cardigan I'd given her. Trevor was there too, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror, looking every bit the confident businessman. They thought they were heading to a courthouse to finalize a theft that would secure their future. They had no idea the courthouse was currently standing on their sidewalk. Have you ever stood on the precipice of a disaster and realized you were the one who engineered the crash? It's a terrifying kind of peace, knowing that the structural failure is finally out of your hands and into the laws. Before I expose the truth behind those signatures, I need to know if you're still watching this unfold with me. Comment A if you think Olivia deserves a chance to walk away, or B if she should face the same fallout as Trevor, and add one short reason why. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. We walked toward the front door as a unit. Evelyn and Officer Walsh led the way, while I stayed 10 steps behind my hand, resting on the heavy weight of the tablet in my jacket pocket. The morning air was damp, smelling of wet pavement and dormant earth. As we reached the steps, I noticed an unfamiliar black SUV parked 2 houses down with its engine idling. The loan sharks were already watching, waiting for Trevor to deliver the deed. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She reached out and pressed the doorbell, the mechanical chime echoing through the thin walls of the rental house. Ding-dong, the sound of a life being served. I heard footsteps approaching from the other side, the sound of the old world ending, and the truth finally stepping into the light. The lock clicked, the handle turned, and the door swung open to reveal my daughter's face, a face that was about to lose its last shred of certainty. Olivia blinked her eyes, darting from Evelyn's sharp leather briefcase to the silver badge gleaming on Officer Walsh's chest, the color draining from her lips, as if I'd just reached out and physically pulled the life from her. She stood frozen in the doorway, her hands still clutching the blue cardigan I gave her last Christmas, a garment that now looked like a shroud. I stepped forward into her line of sight, and the confusion on her face curdled into a raw, naked fear that made my own stomach twist. Trevor's voice barked from the kitchen, demanding to know who was at the door with that aggressive entitlement he wore like a second skin. He rounded the corner, briefcase in hand, ready to head to the courthouse with the forged documents that would have ended my life as I knew it. But he stopped mid-sentence, his boots skidding slightly on the hardwood as he saw the uniform and the clinical cold focus in my eyes. We arrived at the exact minute the predators were preparing to leave their den. Then what are you doing here? Who are these people? Olivia asked, her voice a thin, structural failure. We're coming in. Olivia, I said, my voice as steady as a concrete pour. We have things to discuss that can't wait for the courthouse. We filed into the small living room, the space instantly feeling cramped and clinical. The air smelled of wet wool from the morning mist we'd brought in with us. Evelyn Chambers took the lead, her presence commanding and no nonsense, as she cleared a space on the cluttered coffee table, sweeping aside a stack of glossy travel brochures for Costa Rica. Trevor tried to project a blustering confidence, standing with his chest out and his chin tilted up. This is a private residence. You can't just barge in here, he shouted, his face flushing. Evelyn didn't even look up from her briefcase. Actually, Mr. Morrison, we are here to ensure that your private business remains within the boundaries of the law, she replied. Have you ever felt the air in a room turn to liquid heavy, impossible to breathe, and tasting of copper? That was the atmosphere in that living room as Trevor's eyes began darting toward the back door, measuring the distance for an escape that Officer Walsh was already blocking with his large, silent frame. The authority in the room had shifted entirely, and Trevor knew it. Snap. The briefcase opened, the trap closed. Evelyn pulled out a thick, structured folder with a crisp, professional finality. She began reciting the formal notice, her voice steady and echoing against the thin walls of the rental. Morrison, you are being formally served notice of revocation of power of attorney and an immediate freeze on all assets pending a fraud investigation. I watched my daughter's hands shake as Officer Walsh extended the heavy legal envelope toward her. It's just paper, Olivia, I whispered. Don't look at it like that. But we all knew it was more than paper. It was a concrete block crushing the lies they had built. Evelyn then delivered the final blow, informing Olivia that the freeze extended to her personal checking account, the one where she was hiding the $10,000 down payment Trevor had given her to stay quiet. Olivia collapsed onto the sofa as the realization set in that her own safety net had been shredded. Trevor stepped forward, his jaw tight, and his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. This is ridiculous. He spat, his heavy breathing the only sound in the room. What exactly are you talking about? I didn't answer Trevor with words. Instead, I reached into my jacket and pulled out the tablet, the screen glowing like a digital executioner's blade in the dim light of their living room. Trevor's jaw tightened, his eyes darting between me and the folder Evelyn had just produced. He was still trying to find the oxygen in the room, his chest heaving as he prepared another volley of aggressive bluster. You can't prove a damn thing, Vincent, he spat, his voice cracking with the strain of his own lies. I remained seated on their cheap rented armchair, watching him pace and shout about rights and harassment. He is a structural defect in my family that I am finally ready to collapse. I wait for his volume to peak. For the moment, his desperation turns into a scream before I simply tap the screen of my tablet. I don't need to prove it, Trevor, I said, my voice cutting through his noise with clinical precision. I just need to play it. The sound of his own voice, hushed and intimate, suddenly filled the room, cutting through his shouting like a knife through paper. Audio clip number 1 began to play through the tablet's high-gain speakers, Trevor's midnight call to the mistress from my own kitchen. The room went deathly still as his voice described Olivia as useful weight and the old man's signature machine. He explicitly detailed the plan to flee to Costa Rica the moment the deed transfer cleared, leaving my daughter behind to face the legal fallout of a felony forgery case. Have you ever heard the sound of a person's heart actually breaking? It's not a loud crack. It's the sound of a long, slow exhale that never quite ends. Olivia's face drained of all color. Her eyes fixed on Trevor, as if she were seeing a monster for the first time. The recording even included Trevor mentioning the exact flight number and the September 30th date for his departure, proving he had already purchased the tickets using a secret credit card he'd skimmed from Olivia's own emergency savings account. Pack your bags for Costa Rica, the recorded Trevor said, with a dry chuckle. Just you and me. Useful weight. That's what he called the mother of his child. The recording ended, but the echoes of Trevor's tinny recorded laughter lingered in the air like a foul odor. Olivia was trembling so violently that the legal papers in her hand crinkle like dry leaves in a storm. Trevor tried to step toward her, his hands out in a pleading gesture that looked entirely manufactured, a practiced performance of a man who had run out of real emotions. "Olivia, honey, that's out of context." "He's twisting things," he shouted, but his eyes were wide with a cornered animal's desperation. Olivia recoiled, as if he were made of fire, the taste of salt, from a single tear she didn't even know she was crying, hitting her lip. "What? What is that?" "Trevor," she whispered, her voice a hollow wreck. "Who were you talking to?" As Trevor attempted to lie his way out, Evelyn interjected with a cold, professional sharp edge. "We've already identified the woman on the phone," she said. "She's a paralegal from a rival engineering firm. It seems industrial sabotage was the original motive, Mr. Morrison." Trevor stepped toward me, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. "That's out of context," he started, but I held up a hand. "There is more, Trevor. A lot more." The second audio file was labeled with a timestamp that made my blood run cold, 10:15 a.m., the exact minute my granddaughter usually steps onto the playground for recess. I held the tablet steady, the blue-white glare illuminating the absolute moral horror in the room. I pressed play, and the space was instantly filled with Trevor's cold, transactional voice, describing the layout of Hawthorne Elementary to a debt collector. He detailed the specific fence line where Emma plays and her 10:15 a.m. recess schedule, offering her vulnerability as a guarantee for his underground gambling debts. The clinical way he sold out his own daughter's safety was a level of depravity that left even Evelyn Chambers looking visibly shaken. But then, the recording took a darker turn. Trevor admitted to accepting a protection fee from these criminals to allow them to photograph Emma on the playground for intimidation purposes. My hands didn't shake, but a cold, hard rage settled behind my eyes. How do you breathe when you find out? The man sharing your bed has put a price tag on your child's life. Olivia's entire body went rigid as she listened to the description of the playground fence, where she had waved goodbye to Emma just yesterday. She dropped the legal papers, the dry sheets of bond paper scattering across the rug like autumn leaves. Her hands flew to her mouth to stifle a sob that sounded like a physical breakage of her soul. She looked at Trevor not with love or even the anger of a betrayed wife, but with the hollow stare of someone looking at a monster. "You used her." She whispered the words, barely escaping her throat. "You used our baby to pay for your games." Trevor's face was a mask of sweat and cheap cologne as he tried to backpedal. "I was trying to keep them away from the house, Olivia. I was buying us time." The logic of a coward only served to deepen the silence following his confession. One lunge, one badge, one total collapse of a monster's ego. Trevor finally snapped his bluster, turning into a wild, cornered animal aggression as he lunged toward the tablet in my hand, screaming that I had no right to record his private business. Officer Walsh moved with practiced speed, his leather belt creaking as he intercepted the charge. He blocked Trevor's path and pinned his arm behind his back against the drywall with a force that made the house shudder. Trevor let out a sharp gasp, his cheek pressed into the paint. Because Trevor had explicitly threatened a minor in the recording, Evelyn signaled to Walsh, who transitioned from a civil server to a law enforcement officer performing a protective detention. I stood up, looking down at the man who thought he could steal my house and sell my granddaughter's life. The engineer in me saw the final collapse of the structure. The demolition was complete. Walsh's forearm was a steel bar holding Trevor in place, the sharp scent of adrenaline thick in the air. I looked at Trevor, his face contorted in a mix of pain and fury, and then I turned to my daughter. "It's over, Trevor," I said, my voice as heavy as a burial stone. "But Olivia, for you, it's just beginning. You have a choice to make, and you have exactly 1 minute to make it." The room was silent. The kind of stillness that only comes after a storm has finally broken the windows, leaving nothing but the cold, whistling truth to fill the gaps. I turned my back on Trevor, who was still struggling weakly against Officer Walsh's immovable grip, and focused entirely on Olivia, She was a wreck of a woman trembling on the floor, the smell of fear and stale air in the cramped rental house nearly overpowering. I laid out the two paths available to her with the clinical precision of a final inspection report. You have one choice, Olivia. 1. You stand with him and lose Emma to the state as an accomplice to a felony, or you stand with me and save her. I watched the last of her defensive walls crumble, replaced by the raw, desperate instinct of a mother who finally realized she'd been sleeping next to a predator. I didn't know she sobbed, her voice muffled by her hands. Dad, I swear I didn't know he'd go after her school. I revealed that the loan sharks Trevor feared had actually been monitored by the FBI for months. His recorded confession wasn't just evidence of a theft. It was the final piece needed for a federal racketeering indictment. Have you ever seen a man realize he's been digging his own grave for 6 months? The look in Trevor's eyes was the only payment I ever needed. I pulled a second set of documents from my jacket, the ones I prepared after my call on Friday. I informed Trevor that the FBI was already very interested in his investors and that his recorded ledger was currently being transcribed by a federal task force. Trevor's face went from a flush of rage to a ghostly, translucent pale. You called the feds, he croaked, his voice cracking like dry timber. You'll ruin everything. I didn't blink. I wasn't just a father protecting a home anymore. I was a man containing a toxic spill. I watched him realize that this wasn't just a lawsuit or a family squabble, it was a prison sentence. The magnitude of his strategic failure settled in his eyes, and the bluster finally bled out of him, leaving behind nothing but the hollow shell of a man who had tried to gamble with lives that weren't his to lose. Game over. The house always wins, Trevor, especially when the house is mine. Evelyn Chambers stepped forward with a crisp authority to finalize the legal handoff. She informed Trevor that because of the specific nature of the recording and the threat to a minor, his passport was already flagged, and a temporary restraining order was in effect. Trevor finally stopped fighting Walsh, his body going limp as if his bones had turned to liquid. In a moment of absolute desperation, he tried to bargain accidentally, revealing that the notarized backup folder was hidden under the spare tire in his car. Walsh nodded to a colleague outside, and I knew the physical evidence was as good as secured. I looked at my daughter, who was now sobbing quietly on the rug, and felt no joy, only a somber, exhausted relief. I turned toward the door, the heavy weight of the last 2 weeks finally lifting from my shoulders as I felt the tactile threshold under my boots. As I reached the door, Trevor's voice cracked one last time, high and thin, with the sound of a man drowning in his own choices. This is entrapment. I didn't look back. The walk to my truck was the longest 50 feet of my life, each step on the damp pavement, sounding like a heavy, final, rhythmic thud that signaled the death of the family I thought I knew. I stood on the porch for a fraction of a second, the cool September air biting through my shirt. Trevor's desperate cry of entrapment was still ringing in my ears, a high, thin sound that carried the jagged edge of a man who realized the walls were finally closing in. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the horizon, where the gray Oregon clouds were finally beginning to break, revealing a sliver of cold, uncaring blue. Behind the closed door of the rental, I could hear Trevor's voice rising in a frantic, losing argument with Officer Walsh. Olivia's sobs had transitioned into a low, rhythmic keening that made my chest ache with a phantom weight, the kind of structural pain you feel when you know a foundation is beyond repair. This isn't over, Vincent Trevor screamed, his voice muffled by the wood. You hear me? I whispered the answer to the empty air. It was over the moment you looked at a map of a playground, Trevor. As I reached the sidewalk, I saw the black SUV that had been idling 2 houses down suddenly peel away, its tires chirping against the asphalt. My bluff about the FBI presence had worked better than I'd hoped. The creditors were scatterings like rats from a spotlight. Evelyn Chambers joined me on the sidewalk, her expression as unreadable as a legal brief. She didn't say a word at first, but she placed a firm, supportive hand on my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that anchored me to the present. She informed me that Officer Walsh would remain on site until the primary evidence from Trevor's car was secured, and the initial statements were logged. We watched a second patrol car pull up to the curb with a quiet authority. The welfare check on Emma was being initiated at Hawthorne Elementary. For the first time in 2 weeks, the crushing pressure in my lungs eased, and I felt like I could actually draw a full breath of air. "The state will take it from here," Vincent Evelyn said, her voice a calm bulkhead against the chaos. "Go home." I looked at her, my eyes stinging. "Is she safe, Evelyn? Is Emma really safe?" She nodded once, a sharp, professional movement. "She is. Have you ever won a war only to realize you're the only one left standing on the battlefield? The silence is heavier than the gunfire ever was." I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck and pulled the door shut. The heavy thud sealing out the world of Southeast 82nd Avenue. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, the cold vibration of the idling engine traveling up my arms. I watched the house through the rearview mirror, half expecting it to implode under the weight of the lies I'd exposed. I had saved my assets. I had protected my granddaughter. But the bridge back to my daughter had been burned to the waterline, and the smoke was still thick in the air. Inhale. Exhale. The air tasted like rain and freedom. It was bitter. I pulled my phone from my pocket and found a final text from Warren Phillips. "The cloud account is deleted. Your house is yours again." I turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. But as I glanced at the passenger seat, I saw Emma's forgotten coloring book, the one thing I couldn't protect from the truth. "I am sorry, Patricia," I whispered to the empty cabin. I did what I had to do. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of gray rain and phone calls that felt like echoes from another life. But it was the vibrating buzz of my phone at 10 a.m. on Thursday that finally broke the static. I was standing in the hallway, the faint smell of damp dust hitting my nose, as I unscrewed a dead light bulb, a mundane task, intended to keep my hands from shaking. I answered the call from Evelyn Chambers and held the cold, vibrating device to my ear. She chose Emma. Vincent Evelyn said, her voice carrying a weight of professional satisfaction. "Olivia called my office an hour ago. She's broken, but she's resolute. She has agreed to cooperate fully with the authorities." Evelyn explained that my daughter was currently signing a cooperation agreement, handing over every shred of evidence regarding Trevor's coercion and his gambling contacts. Most importantly, she had filed for an emergency divorce and a petition for sole custody. She had finally chosen her daughter over her fear. "Good," I replied, staring at the empty light socket. "Emma needs her mother, the version of her that isn't afraid of a shadow." Evelyn revealed that because of the clear evidence of coercion, the district attorney had decided not to press criminal charges against Olivia, provided her testimony secured the convictions of the ringleaders. 2 weeks later, the Oregon autumn had turned sharp and biting. I was in my workshop when Evelyn called again. FBI, raid, arrest. Those 3 words felt like the closing of a heavy iron door. The system I had trusted to protect my life had finally turned its gears against the man who tried to dismantle it. Evelyn informed me that the federal task force had executed a coordinated strike on the illegal gambling ring Trevor was indebted to. 5 major arrests were made, including his primary creditor, effectively erasing the physical threat to Emma's school. "The vulture is caged, Mr. Carter," she said. "Trevor is facing 5 to 7 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy." And the school, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Are those men gone?" "They're processed and in custody," she assured me. "The threat is neutralized." I learned that Trevor had attempted to flee to the airport 2 hours before the raid, but his passport had already been flagged by the FBI contact I provided. He was arrested right there in the security line, clutching a carry-on bag full of stolen hopes. I hung up and walked out to the backyard garden, the air smelling of dormant earth and the coming winter. Have you ever noticed how roses bloom brightest right before the first frost? It's as if they know they have to make the beauty count. Patricia's roses were still blooming, a vibrant red defiance against the encroaching gray. I touched a petal gently, the tactile softness a strange contrast to my own calloused thumb. The structural failure of my family had been shored up by federal steel, and the threat had been eliminated at its very source. I stood in the silence, listening to the autumn wind whistle through the garden beds, realizing that the weight of the coloring book I still kept in my truck was finally starting to feel a little lighter. "It's over, Patricia," I whispered to the wind. The fortress held. I touched the last red rose of the season and whispered, "It's over." But as I walked back inside, I knew there was one more legal document that needed my signature, one that would change Olivia's life forever. How much is a daughter's loyalty worth once it's been appraised, traded, and found wanting in the cold light of a forged signature? The walk back into my house had felt different with Trevor behind bars, but the structural integrity of my family was still compromised. I arrived at Evelyn's office for a final permanent legal restructuring on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The long orange glow of the autumn sunset spilled through the windows, casting skeletal shadows across the mahogany desk. I sat across from Evelyn Chambers one last time, the smell of mahogany and old leather anchoring me. "We weren't here to discuss arrests today. We were here for the final demolition. I want her removed from every schedule of assets, Evelyn. Totally and permanently," I said, my voice steady. It wasn't an act of malice, but a structural necessity. I cannot leave my life's work to someone who proved they could be bent by the first predator to come along. "Are you sure, Vincent?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "This is a bell you can't unring." I nodded without hesitation. "I'm an engineer, Evelyn. I know when a beam is too warped to hold weight. A will is just a blueprint for a life that hasn't ended yet. And like any good blueprint, it needs a failsafe." The second half of the document was the reconstruction. I established an irrevocable spendthrift trust for Emma, ensuring her education, healthcare, and future were shielded from both Trevor's greed and Olivia's poor judgment. I appointed a corporate trustee to manage the funds, removing the temptation from Olivia entirely. "Emma is the future of this family," I explained. "She's the only part left that hasn't been compromised." As I reviewed the Emma provision, I realized I was building a bridge for my granddaughter that her mother would never be allowed to cross. However, I included a conditional amnesty clause. Olivia would receive a modest monthly stipend, but only if she maintained a permanent restraining order against Trevor and completed a court-ordered financial responsibility program. It was a door I was leaving ajar, though I didn't expect her to walk through it anytime soon. Love means consequences, and I was finally enforcing them. Ink, paper, seal. The family tree was pruned. Evelyn placed the heavy stack of paper in front of me, and the fountain pen felt cold and balanced in my hand. I signed each page with the same steady hand that once drafted thousands of bridge blueprints. With each stroke of black ink, the Morrison influence was purged from my legacy. As I signed the final page, Evelyn handed me a small envelope left by Trevor's mistress. It contained a coded key to a digital offshore account Trevor had hidden even from Olivia. I didn't even look at the balance. I simply pushed it across the desk toward Evelyn. "Give this to the corporate trustee for Emma," I said. "Let it be the first stone in her new foundation." When the last document was notched and filed, I felt a strange, hollow peace. The fortress was finished, the perimeter was secure, and the old man was finally truly alone inside it. "Thank you, Evelyn, for everything," I whispered. I stood up and felt the tactile weight of the completed trust in my mind. I walked out to the parking lot and looked at the sunset, my shadow stretching out long and thin across the pavement, a solitary figure in a world I had spent my final strength to secure. The first frost of November arrived a week later, turning the garden into a silver graveyard of summer memories. And it was in that brittle silence that my phone chimed with a name I hadn't seen on the screen in 42 days. I was standing at my lathe in the workshop, the mechanical hum and the smell of cedar shavings providing a rhythmic sanctuary that I had come to rely on. I stopped the motor, the silence rushing back into the room like a flood, and looked at the notification lighting up my workbench. It was a simple text from Olivia. "Can we talk? Just us. Bluebird Park at 2 o'clock. After everything, the recordings, the FBI raid, and the restated trust that had essentially excised her from my legacy. The brevity of the message felt like a structural tremor in my newly reinforced life. As I navigated the settings to reply, I discovered that she had been trying to call me from a restricted number for weeks. My new security software, the very fortress I had built to keep the predators out, had been silently blocking her, leaving me more isolated than I had ever intended to be. Cedar shavings are like memories. If you don't sweep them up, they get under your skin and start to itch. I stared at the phone for nearly 20 minutes, watching the fine cedar dust settle on the glass screen like a dusting of November snow. Part of me wanted to maintain the perimeter, to stay inside the safety of the locks and the legal bulwarks I had spent so much energy constructing. But then I remembered Emma's coloring book, sitting on the passenger seat of my truck, a quiet reminder of the innocent life caught in the crossfire of our collapse. I realized that while the legal battle was won, the human wreckage still needed to be cleared away before the winter set in. I typed a single word, yes, and felt the internal pressure of a dam that was no longer as solid as I believed. I am not doing this for him, I whispered to the empty rafters. I am doing this for her. One word, yes. The bridge was rebuilt with a single keystroke, however fragile the span might be. I cleaned the workshop with a meticulousness that bordered on the obsessive putting every chisel and gauge back into its specific shadowboard silhouette. I changed into the heavy jacket I had worn to Evelyn's office, checking my pocket to ensure the tablet wasn't there. I won't need weapons today, I told myself. Just the truth. Whatever is left of it. As I walked toward my truck, the biting November air nipped at my lungs, reminding me that some structures can be repaired, while others can only be replaced by something entirely new. I pulled out of the driveway and paused at the curb. Across the street, a white moving van was parked at the rental house. Trevor's mistress was methodically clearing out his belongings, revealing that the parallel life he had built was being dismantled by the very people he had trusted. The demolition was total. I drove toward Bluebird Park with a somber determination, my boots crunching on the frost-covered grass as I approached the duck pond. I saw her sitting on a bench near the frozen water, a silhouette of grief in a heavy coat I didn't recognize. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have a blueprint for what to say next. Bluebird Park was empty, the playground equipment standing like skeletal remains under the gray sky. I walked across the frozen grass, the rhythmic crunch of each step echoing in the silence of the November afternoon. I saw Olivia sitting on the bench by the duck pond, her silhouette small and huddled against a cold wind that whipped through her winter coat. I sat down on the opposite end of the frost-slicked bench, the distance between us exactly 4 feet. A physical gap that felt like a canyon neither of us knew how to bridge. She didn't look at me for a long time, her eyes fixed on the frozen water, where a few brave ducks huddled near the reeds. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin and fragile like dry glass. I was so afraid of losing the house that I lost everything else instead, she whispered. She admitted she knew Trevor was in financial trouble, but claimed she never knew the extent of the depravity regarding Emma. I listened with the clinical detachment of a lead engineer inspecting a collapsed structure, looking for what could be salvaged. She revealed she'd already started working a minimum wage job at a local grocery store to support Emma. It was the first sign of responsibility I'd seen in years. "Do you still hate me, Dad?" she asked, her gaze finally flickering toward mine. 0%. That was her rating. My own daughter. I didn't answer her question directly. Instead, I laid out the conditions of our future relationship with the precision of a contract. I told her about the irrevocable trust I'd established for Emma and the conditional stipend for her own survival. I made it clear that while I would remain a grandfather, my role as her father had changed from provider to overseer. Emma's future is sealed, I said, the cold air biting at my lungs. Yours is up to you. There will be no more joint accounts, no more power of attorney, and no more secrets. If that trust is broken again, the bridge is gone for good. Trust isn't a gift, Olivia. It's a structure, And right now, yours has a 0% safety rating. She nodded slowly, accepting the terms with a resignation that suggested she had expected far worse. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the ghosts of the family we used to be before greed and a predator named Trevor had dismantled the foundation. Can a bridge ever be truly safe again after it's been sabotaged from the inside? Or do you just spend the rest of your life waiting for the next crack? I watched Olivia stand up, her movement slow and stiff from the cold. "Thank you for the stipend," she said, her eyes red-rimmed. "I'll start the financial responsibility program on Monday." I didn't offer her a hug. I didn't offer her a way back into my house. I stayed seated, a solitary figure in a coat that felt too heavy. "Goodbye, Olivia. Drive safe," I replied. I watched her walk toward her car, her small frame disappearing into the gathering mist of the Oregon afternoon. The fortress I had built was now the only thing I had left to inhabit. As she pulled away, I realized she had left a small, cream-colored envelope on the bench. It wasn't a request for money or a plea for forgiveness. I opened it to find a handwritten letter from Emma, the only person whose trust remained untarnished by the wreckage. I watched her car disappear into the mist, and as I reached for Emma's envelope, I saw my own reflection in the frozen pond, a man who had protected his wealth, but stood entirely alone in the frost. The workshop was warmer than the park, but it felt just as empty. I didn't open Emma's letter until I was back in the sanctuary of my workbench, the smell of cedar shavings rising to meet me like an old friend who didn't care about my mistakes. I sat on my stool and carefully unfolded the paper. Emma's childish handwriting revealed a truth I hadn't expected. She knew Daddy was going away because she had seen him packing his suitcase weeks before the confrontation. It was a sobering reminder that children see the cracks in a structure long before the adults are willing to admit the building is falling. I set the letter aside, my heart heavy with the realization that my granddaughter had been living in the shadow of a collapse for far longer than I had. The first month of our new reality passed with a clinical, quiet consistency. Every Sunday, Olivia brings Emma to the house for a 4-hour supervised visit. She stays in the kitchen, punctual and quiet, serving a sentence in the quietest prison imaginable. I brought her favorite snacks, Dad, she told me last Sunday, her voice low. "They're on the counter." I only nodded. "Thank you, Olivia. We'll be in the shop if you need us." Trust is like a finish on fine mahogany. Once you strip it away, you can never quite get the same luster back, but the wood underneath is still solid. In the workshop, I finally began the lessons I promised. Emma stands on a sturdy step stool I built specifically for her, her small hands guided by mine as we sand a block of pine for a birdhouse. The sound of the hand plane smoothing a board provided a rhythmic background to our work. I find myself explaining the mechanics of stress and support, not just in wood, but in the world. I am teaching her that some things are built to last, while others are built to be replaced, and that the quality of the material matters more than the finish. "Is it strong now, Grandpa?" she asked, her eyes bright with a curiosity that Trevor hadn't managed to extinguish. "It's getting there, Emma," I replied, guiding her hand across the grain. "You have to find the grain first." I took a sip of hot, bitter coffee, the warmth a welcome relief against the cold draft near the door. Click. The screen went black. I was no longer a spy. I was just a grandfather. On a Tuesday night, as the first real snow began to dust the Oregon pines, I sat at my workbench and opened the surveillance software one last time. I watched the empty rental house across the street, now bearing a for lease sign in the yard. Then I toggled the feed to Olivia's new apartment. She was sitting with Emma, helping her with homework, the scene mundane and safe. As I prepared to log off, I noticed a notification from my bank. Olivia had been putting half of her modest monthly stipend into a savings account for me, a quiet, unforced attempt to pay back the theft. I realized then that a fortress is only a prison if you never let yourself leave. With a single deliberate click, I deleted the remote access software forever. "The perimeter is secure," I whispered to the empty shop. "Good night, Emma." Good night, Olivia. I walked to the workshop door and flipped the switch, leaving the tools in the dark. As I stepped out into the biting November air, I saw my own footprints in the fresh snow leading away from the fortress and toward the house. The garden outside was a skeleton of its former self, buried under a foot of Oregon snow. But inside the workshop, the air was warm and thick with the scent of cherry wood and the quiet concentration of a child. I watched my own footprints in the fresh snow leading back toward the house from the night before, a trail of resolve that felt permanent now. Emma and I were working on a small jewelry box, a replica of the one I had made for Patricia 30 years ago. I watched her small hands follow the grain of the cherry wood, her brow furrowed in that same engineering focus I used to see in my own reflection. As we worked, I noticed a small notebook tucked into her pocket. She pulled it out to show me sketches of the garden and the lathe, detailed drawings that mirrored my own analytical worldview. "Will the roses remember to come back, Grandpa?" She asked, her voice light against the howling wind outside. "The roots are deep, Emma," I replied, placing my calloused hand over hers. "They never forget where they belong. I am teaching her that sleep isn't death. It's just a structural pause, and that some things have to be sanded down to their rawest form before they can truly shine. Fine grit, no more rough edges." The healing had finally begun. We moved from the coarse sandpaper to the fine grit, the wood becoming smooth as silk under Emma's palm. She grew quiet for a moment, the only sound the rhythmic rasp of the paper against the cherry. "Mommy said she's learning how to fix things," she said, looking up at me. "Like you, Grandpa." I felt the last of my anger toward Olivia turning into a manageable, distant weight, much like the sawdust we were currently brushing away. "Exactly like me, sweetheart," I told her. "We're all just trying to keep the house standing." I didn't tell her about the court dates or the stipend I'd arranged. I only wanted her to know that everyone sometimes makes a mistake in their blueprints. The quality of the material is what matters, and despite the fractures Trevor had caused, the wood of this family was still salvageable if we worked slowly enough. I felt a sense of forgiveness taking root, a quiet reconstruction of the bridge I thought I had burned to the waterline. Wood oil is like time. It doesn't change the nature of the thing, it just makes the truth of it easier to see. We applied the first coat of oil together, watching the cherry wood deepen into a rich, protective amber. Emma's eyes lit up as the grain revealed itself, a hidden pattern that had been there all along, just waiting for the right touch. "It's beautiful, Grandpa," she whispered. "It looks like it's glowing." "That is because it is strong on the inside, Emma," I said. "That is what matters." I realized then that my survival wasn't about the money or the deed. It was about being the one person left to show her the pattern. As we finished, I turned the box over and showed her the small letter C I had carved into the bottom, a Carter legacy reclaimed from the Morrison influence forever. I looked at the empty spot on the wall where the hidden camera used to be, then back at my granddaughter, and I finally understood that the best way to watch over someone isn't with a lens, but with a steady hand. I felt a sense of completion that no structural report could ever provide. The snow stopped falling just as Olivia's car pulled into the driveway. The snow stopped falling just as Olivia's car pulled into the driveway. The silence that followed. Not the heavy, suffocating kind I'd lived with for months, but something lighter like a building that had finally settled into its new foundation. I stood on the porch, my breath blooming in the cold air, as Olivia secured Emma into her car seat. We didn't exchange words of forgiveness. We simply exchanged a look of mutual recognition of the new hard boundaries that define our lives. "See you next Sunday, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Next Sunday, Olivia." "Drive safe," I replied. She drove away, and I was left with the quiet dominance of a man who fought a war in the shadows and won back the right to live in the light. The fortress was no longer a bunker. It was just a home again. I watched the taillights fade, knowing the perimeter I'd built didn't just protect my money, but the fragile chance for my daughter to become the mother Emma deserves. I returned to the workshop, the smell of cold cedar and wood oil greeting me. I opened my laptop for the final time in this professional capacity. I found the encrypted chat with Warren Phillips, the man who had given me the eyes to see through Trevor's lies. I tried to process the final payment, but I realized Warren had already refused it. He'd left a short note seeing a master engineer at work was payment enough. I felt a surge of mutual respect for the man across the street who had risked his own peace for mine. "The job is done, Warren. Wipe the drive I typed. Operation complete." Vincent came the immediate reply. "Take care of that granddaughter. Delete. Erase. Gone." The digital ghosts were finally laid to rest. It was the final engineering check on a bridge I never wanted to build, but one that saved my family from a total structural collapse. What is the weight of a secret once it's been told it's nothing? It's lighter than the air in an empty workshop. As I initiated the final wipe of the laptop, I discovered one last hidden file Warren had left for me. I clicked it, and suddenly the workshop was filled with the sound of Patricia's voice. It was a recording from a years-old backed-up security test we'd forgotten about. "Vincent, honey, don't forget to come in for dinner," she said, her voice warm and full of the life we'd shared. It was an audible blessing from the woman who had started the garden, a final reassurance that the foundation we'd laid together was still holding firm. I closed the laptop, the lid clicking shut, with a sound of absolute finality. I listened to the house. It was quiet, but it was a living silence. The hum of the refrigerator, the wind in the pines, the absence of Trevor's predatory pacing. I looked at the jewelry box. Emma and I had finished the oil, giving the cherry wood a soft, protective glow. I am an old man with a steady hand, and for the first time in a very long time, I don't feel the need to watch anything at all. No more cameras. Rest easy, Patricia. The house is safe. I stood in the center of the room and breathed in the scent of cedar one last time before flipping the light switch, finally content to let the shadows be just shadows. The gravel crunched under my boots as I crossed the yard, a solitary sound, in a neighborhood that had finally stopped feeling like a battlefield. I had stepped out of the workshop and flipped the switch, leaving the tools in the dark, and as I walked toward the house, I saw my own footprints in the fresh snow, leading away from the fortress I'd inhabited for so long. I didn't reach for my phone to check the perimeter. I didn't even feel the phantom vibration that had haunted my thigh for months. I realized then that my psychological recovery had finally caught up to my legal victory. I stood on the back porch and looked at the heavy brass master key in my hand, the one that opens every door in a house I almost lost. I thought about the months spent behind monitors, the cold calculations, and the weight of the tablet that used to live in my pocket. Now there are no cameras hidden in the eaves and no software monitoring the digital air. The greatest engineering feat of my life wasn't building the fortress, but knowing when it was finally safe enough to take the walls down. "A home isn't a structure you defend," I whispered to the cold Oregon night. "It's a place where you finally stop looking over your shoulder." I turned and looked out at the snow-covered garden, where Patricia's roses sleep beneath the frost safe and undisturbed. The orange glow of the sunset hit the white drifts, turning the backyard into a sea of fire and ice. The cycle of seasons is the ultimate blueprint, a reminder that even the deepest winter is just a preparation for a new spring. I am an old man, and my hands are tired, but as I look at the house, I know that Emma's future is as secure as the roots of those roses. I've done my job. The foundation is deep, the materials are honest, and the house stands firm. The roots are deep enough now, I thought, feeling a triumphant peace. Sleep well, Patricia. I've finished the work. The curtain is more than fabric. It's the final boundary of a man's soul. It is the line between the public war and the private peace. I stood there for a long minute, letting the cold bite into my lungs one last time. A reminder that I was still here, still standing, and still the master of my own domain. Click. The lock turned. The story ended. I opened the back door and stepped into the sudden welcoming warmth of the kitchen, the smell of wood oil and my old jacket clinging to me. I set the master key on the anniversary bowl, the ceramic clink sounding like a gavel, bringing a long trial to order. I looked out the window one last time at the fading light over the pines. There are no more secrets, no more recordings, and no more shadows to chase. Before I walked away from the glass, I thought of the small digital drive I'd tucked into the back of the jewelry box Emma and I finished. It contains a video message for her to open on her 18th birthday, explaining why her grandfather did what he did, ensuring the truth survives long after my own heartbeat fades. "Good night, world," I murmured. "I'm home." I pulled the curtain shut, the darkness of the yard disappearing as the warm light of the kitchen took hold. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to look back. The structure was sound. The project was complete. Looking back at this family story, my biggest mistake wasn't trusting my daughter. It was staying silent when I first noticed the cracks in our foundation. I thought ignoring the warning signs would protect them, but silence only gave the rot more room to grow. Don't be like me. Don't wait until your entire world is collapsing before you start asking the hard questions about what's really happening inside your own home. This dad revenge wasn't just about reclaiming stolen assets. It was about teaching a brutal lesson that trust is a structure, and once you sabotage it from within, the entire building comes down. The strongest fortresses aren't built with steel and concrete, but with truth and accountability. I truly believe the Lord's timing is always perfect, even when it feels like a storm is tearing everything apart. He gave me the strength to be the father and grandfather my family story needed, even when it meant becoming someone I never thought I'd be. My dad revenge taught me this: protection isn't just about locks and legal documents. It's about having the courage to enforce consequences when the people you love cross lines that should never be crossed. The master key of integrity is the only legacy worth leaving behind. In every family story, there comes a moment when you must choose between comfortable lies and painful truths. I chose truth, and though it cost me dearly, my granddaughter will grow up knowing that some things like her safety and her future are worth any price. This dad revenge is complete. The fortress stands. And I finally understand that love sometimes means letting people hit the ground hard enough to wake up. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. Please leave a comment, sharing your perspective. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation where your own family betrayed your trust? I genuinely want to hear your viewpoint. If this narrative resonated with you emotionally, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss future content. A gentle reminder: while inspired by real-world themes of family conflict and financial fraud, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content doesn't align with your preferences, feel free to explore other videos that might suit you better.